Welcome and thank you to Dr. Jennifer Lundine.
Thanks, Kedar. I appreciate those kind words. And I am very happy to be here with all of you today. As Kedar mentioned, my work related to brain injury starts quite a long time ago. I was a speech pathologist or speech therapist at Nationwide Children's Hospital for a long time before I went back to school to do more of the research and teaching parts related to traumatic brain injury. So my experience is primarily related to young people who sustain traumatic brain injuries. But obviously, young people grow up and become adults with brain injuries as well. And so, what I'm talking about today is not specific to young people with brain injuries, and hopefully will be able to be relatable to anyone who has had an experience with brain injury, whether it's yourself or you as a care partner or a parent or a significant other of someone with a traumatic brain injury. So I was really excited to be asked to talk to you today because part of my research work deals with listening to and gathering stories from people who've experienced brain injury. And I'll talk a little bit about that sort of in the middle of my shared talk tonight as an example of how we can use stories to help make things better, hopefully. So my talk is about how your story can help change the narrative. So what we'll talk about just briefly tonight, and I'm open to questions and comments throughout, is the importance of telling your story. I'll share some of my research examples about how I use stories and how stories of survivors and family members can help us move research and practice forward. And then some different ideas about how you can tell your story. So sort of the practical way to begin to think about that for yourself. So let's start out with a quick discussion about the importance of telling your story. So again, hopefully piggybacking on the conversation last week, but thinking about why your story is important and why it would be important that you share your experiences. So one reason is that your story helps normalize other people's experiences. I don't know if you're a dog person, but I love dogs. And particularly when I feel stressed, looking at funny dog memes makes me happy. So I shared this fun meme with this cute little dog, putting his paw up on a person's leg saying, don't worry, I know how you feel. And the idea of sharing your story is helpful because even though we can never know exactly how another person feels, and all of our experiences, even if they're similar, will be unique to each of us individually, once we listen to someone else's story and identify where we have shared experiences, then we can empathize with that person, even if our experiences haven't been identical. And this can be helpful for the person who is sharing their story in processing their difficult experiences or the challenges that they've faced. But it can also be helpful and therapeutic for the person who's listening to that story as well. And this can be the case if you are a survivor of a traumatic brain injury, but also if you're a care partner or a parent of someone who has had a traumatic brain injury. Another reason to think about sharing your story is that it helps to connect you to other people with similar experiences. So similar to the previous slide where we talked about how your story can help others who may be having this similar type of experience, sharing your story can help you learn from others who've also had a similar experience. When I worked at Children's Hospital, we would often invite family members in to talk to parents whose child was newly admitted with a traumatic brain injury. And even though that visiting family who had had a longer time to process their experience with brain injury could never guarantee that this new patient would have the same experience, it allowed the parent who was just fresh in this traumatic experience to understand and to see someone who had gotten to the other side of the hospitalization, for example. And so when you share your stories with other people, it may help to identify for you a new resource that you hadn't thought of. Talking to someone who, for example, might share that they were having a lot of pain, and so they invested in massage therapy, and that really helped them. That may be something that you hadn't thought of for yourself, and it may give you some ideas for new resources that you might be able to investigate for yourself. Your story also helps other people understand your experience. This meme I liked: no one is perfect, and that's why understanding is so important. And we can't understand people if we don't understand their story and we don't know where they're coming from. By sharing your story, you help people understand you better. One of my former patients who experienced a traumatic brain injury when she was a teenager now is an adult, and she often comes and talks to one of my graduate level classes. And at the beginning of her talk, she always shares the following with my students. She says something like, because of my brain injury, sometimes it takes me a minute to process what you've said to me, and I need extra time to think of a response. So I might wait longer than you're used to respond to your question. I may stand here silently, and that may make you uncomfortable. But I'm using that time to think, so please be patient with me. And I always have loved that, and it impresses me because, again, that is an example of her sharing her experiences so that people can understand what exactly she's going through in that moment. And that is really helpful information to hear. I mean, I think we would all be better off if we described a little bit about what we were feeling internally. If I one evening shared with my family, I didn't sleep well last night and I'm a little grumpier than normal, they may know to stay away from me, right? That would be helpful if I shared that information with them. So in that same way, thinking kind of the bigger picture, the experiences that you have as a result of either having a brain injury or living with or taking care of a person with a traumatic brain injury are much bigger parts of your story and can help people understand you and the struggles and challenges that you may be experiencing in your life. Your story can also personally and positively impact your care. And first, I want to talk about advocacy. And by sharing your story, you can help to advocate for yourself or for your loved one. It can help you receive better services to address any needs or challenges that you might have. So just like the individual that I described previously, who comes to talk to my class, her story helps her advocate for herself. People understand that they need to wait and give her time to process information. So you can use your story to help you get the care that you need to make you more successful or to make your life better. And again, this applies not just to survivors, but also to care partners or caregivers or parents of individuals who've sustained a traumatic brain injury. Explaining your experience with traumatic brain injury and how it impacts your life can help you get the support that you need from friends or family or your workplace or your school. And sharing your story can also personally and positively impact your care from a policy perspective. So in addition to just advocating for yourself and your needs, sharing your story can also help to positively impact policy surrounding traumatic brain injury. Having just come out of an election season, we're not going to talk about that tonight, but I know everyone has heard a lot about your vote is your voice. And that's true. But you can do more than just vote to elect people to make decisions on your behalf. Sharing your story can help lead to positive policy changes related to brain injury prevention and care and rehabilitation too. We now have legislation that requires young people playing sports who sustain a concussion to be cleared by a medical professional before they return to sports. And the reason this happened throughout all 50 states is because people shared their stories. Family members shared the story of their students or their children who sustained a concussion and returned to a football game or a soccer game before they were ready, and the dramatic implications that that had on their life. So by sharing their story, that helped to make policy changes that now are used to protect young people across all sports and in all 50 states. So combining researchers and medical professionals to these storytellers also helps us to advocate for policy changes that can help, again, across all aspects of brain injury, whether it's prevention or the immediate care that people receive or the long-term rehabilitation. So again, by sharing stories with policymakers, we can help to impact, say, insurance coverage by adding researchers and medical professionals to also share stories related to treatment strategies. We may be able to get a new treatment covered by insurance, for example. So that is our first section. And now I'd like to move in really briefly and not too detailed, just to talk to you about some of the research that I've done that involves family members sharing their story. So I'm currently working on a project with some colleagues at Nationwide Children's Hospital and also a colleague up in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve University. And we are interviewing caregivers of children who have sustained a traumatic brain injury. And I'll explain to you that our next step is also going to involve hearing the stories of medical providers once we finish sharing the stories of caregivers. So in this study, what we did is we have talked to 19 families, 19 caregivers of children who sustained a traumatic brain injury. And those kids sustained their injuries when they were very young up through adolescence. And some of these families have been living with a child with traumatic brain injury for several years in their home. And in doing interviews with them, what we do is ask very open-ended questions so that we're trying to just hear the stories that these families are telling. We're not asking questions where they can simply say yes or no. We're asking them to tell us about their experience in the hospital and tell us about their experience returning their child back to school. And then what we do is we take all these interviews and we look for different themes that come from them. And this slide shows you the different themes that we've identified in these nearly 20 interviews with parents of children who've had a TBI. And I wanted to share a couple of the quotes that have come from those interviews. And I just picked two of the themes and I just selected a couple quotes. But again, what I want you to think about as I read these quotes or read parts of these quotes is whether or not any of these experiences might be similar to experiences that you had either with your own injury or with your family member's injury or a friend's injury. And again, these are related primarily to kids, but thinking about how they might relate to an adult with a traumatic brain injury as well. So this slide talks about hospital-related experiences. And one thing that is in the slides that Julie shared, you'll see that most of the comments that families made had some sort of negative connotation. So we considered those barriers to their overall care. Now, families did talk about good things as well, and I'll share some of those examples too. So not everything is bad, and we're not looking just for bad things. We want to look for good things too, because that helps us figure out what's working. So thinking about hospital-related experience, we had a parent who shared that you, being a medical professional, may have said something a week ago, but I didn't hear you because my kid was on a ventilator, so their child needed help breathing, and we didn't know if she was going to live. So I feel like it's hard because everyone throws themselves at you, but then that's it. They never come back. And so then it's like, oh, maybe I remember that, and maybe I don't. I don't know. It's just you're kind of in a fog at that point, and you don't hear anybody. And another parent said, when you're inpatient, you're treated amazing, but I think that there's a disconnect for the outpatient clinics. I mean, just to continue her therapy, we waited forever to get orders and changes, and no one calls you back for weeks on end, and it's frustrating. And another parent said, it would have been nice for me to have had someone that could have come here, maybe to work with me in my home environment to teach me a little bit. And then, as I promised, there are positive quotes as well. So one parent shared, I felt like they gave us a wealth of information about what to expect and, just what going home would look like. So on this slide, I think some of these quotes go to the idea that maybe medical professionals don't always realize that in the hospital, even though we're trying to provide information to families, there are times when families might be better able to receive that information than other times. Maybe immediately after that injury is a really hard time to talk about, serious long-term consequences of brain injury, right? Like this first parent says, my kid was on a vent and we didn't even know if she was going to live. So she doesn't say these words exactly, but like, don't talk to me about, going back to school. I'm not ready to hear that. And I'm not even going to remember what you told me because I'm so worried about my child. And then another quote, the second quote makes us think about how we might be providing lots and lots of intensive services when the child, in this case, is in the hospital, but where there's a disconnect when families leave the hospital. And perhaps, I think we would all probably agree with this, perhaps we could do better in connecting those services once people leave the hospital. And then again, thinking about the kind of education we're providing, and are we really preparing people to return home in all cases? And then on this slide, I share some quotes from families about returning their child to school. And on this one, I'll start with the positive quotes. So one parent said, at school, I'm really glad the school recognized that he needs extra help. And another parent said, I really can't think of anything further they could have done because they worked with me every step of the way. Another parent said, because in my area, I don't know about the bigger cities, they don't know a lot about brain injury. So you're fighting with the school all the time. And so for a little background, this was a family that lived about 2.5 hours away from Columbus. And so they talked a lot about some of the frustrations they had in their smaller town because they felt like people didn't understand brain injury like maybe they did in the city of Columbus, for example. And then this last quote really resonates with me. And I think this parent is very descriptive. And again, I'd ask you to think about your story and whether or not this can connect with you in any way, even if you didn't have to deal with going back to school after a brain injury. There's not enough resources for people with traumatic brain injuries, nor is there enough education. I feel like they have a school for the blind, they have a school for the deaf, they have all types of schools for people and kids with disabilities. But when it comes to traumatic brain injuries, I feel like they throw them out to the wolves. They put them back into these regular schools, public schools that they attended before their injury. They throw them out to the wolves. There are no resources. The schools are not educated enough. They do not take it serious enough either. And that quote really hits me because again, what this parent is talking about is a really difficult experience in trying to get, her child the appropriate services that he or she needed following their brain injury. And I think they, again, the descriptive words that she uses really help me understand how challenging that has been for that family. So what do these stories tell us, and how will we use this information from a research perspective? So as I shared, there are both positives and negatives that families have across all of these interviews. And what's important as a clinician and as a researcher is trying to find where these families' experiences interact. So one quote is important to that family, but what we look for here is the same types of ideas that are shared across families. So again, thinking about those first slides about how your story connects to other people's stories. So we then look to see, are there certain factors that lead a family to have negative experiences with a school, for example, or negative experiences with insurance companies? Or are there particular factors that might set families apart who report that everything was great at school? What are those things? And then how can we try to carry those factors into those families' lives that may have different types of challenges? So by gathering lots of different stories and looking at the different themes that come up, we can start to try to put these together to tell a larger story about the experience of traumatic brain injury for families who have children that sustain a traumatic brain injury. And then we can try to act on that information. So thinking about advocacy and policy changes, what kinds of things could we change in the way that we provide care to make the experience better for families? And that's how we will involve medical professionals in our next step. So taking the family's stories and sharing those with medical providers who work with kids who have traumatic brain injury. And medical providers have knowledge of the medical environment and the care that we're able to provide at a hospital like Nationwide Children's. But maybe they would be surprised to hear some of the stories or some of the experiences that families are talking about. Maybe they don't understand how difficult it is for families to receive medical information at those, in those first minutes when they're in the hospital, for example. And so reinforcing that may help change the way we provide education to families in the hospital so that families receive and hear and understand that information better. So those will be our next steps. And then ultimately, our goal is to try to identify strategies that we could try and implement within the hospital or once families go home to try to make those experiences better. So that's how we use storytelling in research that I am a part of. So now I want to briefly talk about basic steps that you could use to think about how to begin telling and sharing your story. So first of all, there are many different ways to express your story. I talked about interviews that we're doing with family members, but certainly using one-on-one conversations or interviews are not the only way to tell your story. You could tell your story using poetry or music. You could journal your story. You could share that publicly, or you could choose to keep that to yourself or share that with a small number of people who are close to you. As Kedar mentioned, there are lots of programs using art to help people tell their story. And this link at the bottom of this slide is actually from the American Scientist, a publication that shared a project where people were using art to help them heal from traumatic experiences. And I actually really liked this picture that I borrowed from them because sometimes I feel like that is, I think that's probably what we all feel like on some days, right? We may not look like a monster, but we may feel like a monster, or we have a monster inside of us, even though we look okay on the outside. So I really liked that example. And art is a great way that we can tell our story if that is more moving to you than, say, writing or sharing your story verbally. So what are some questions you could think about to help you begin to tell your story? So some of the things we ask in my research are things like, how has your life changed since your injury? And remember here, it could be your injury, it could be your family member's injury, your child's injury, your significant other's injury. What are positive things that have come out of your injury? And you may say positive, this is a traumatic brain injury. What is good about that? But sometimes families will talk about how they realized that they had really great support systems in their community, or that their school rallied around them, or their workplace, was really understanding and forgiving about, giving them time off, or their coworkers, donated time off to help them be with their family member in the hospital. So sometimes there are positives that can come out of a traumatic experience like a TBI. And of course, what are the challenges that you might have experienced as a result of the injury, whether it is during the hospital time or now that you've returned home, or even long-term after the injury. And also thinking about what struggles you might experience, whether that's now, whether that's previously, or maybe even what challenges or struggles you fear facing in the future as a result of your injury. And then thinking about how you could address those. Are there policy changes that would help you maybe get away from these challenges? What might help you address this problem that you have now or that you are concerned about in the future? What do you wish people knew about you now? So just like I was shared with you about my former patient who talked about the processing time that she needs, what do you wish people understood about you, about your injury or the experiences related to your injury? How can that help other people understand you better? And then thinking about what about your story might help someone else. Is there something that you wish you knew before you began this journey, this unfortunate journey that is a result of a traumatic brain injury? What would potentially help someone else who is just beginning on this journey or is maybe having similar or different struggles than you faced yourself? And what information do you wish you knew, which I sort of just mentioned about how that might help someone else. So thinking about how information that you wish you knew that you've learned since your injury that might be able to help someone else and how that could have helped you. And of course, thinking about whose perspective. Everyone's perspective is valuable and important. So the research that I shared with you, we've involved caregivers and we will involve medical professionals, but we haven't involved the survivors of brain injury themselves in this specific study. In some other studies that I've been involved in, we have gotten the perspective of survivors as well. But thinking about whose perspective you're gathering and again, why that is important. So my point here is that anyone's perspective can share valuable information. So it doesn't have to be just the person who sustained a traumatic brain injury, but anyone whose life was also affected by that injury has a story to tell that is valuable to other people. And by sharing that can also help themselves. So how can you do this? How can you begin to engage in sharing your story? Well, of course, you can look for research opportunities. I have opportunities, in projects that I'm working on, and my research focuses primarily on individuals who experience their brain injury when they're younger. But there are research opportunities seeking stories from adults who've sustained their brain injury and their family members or caregivers as well. But this is not just for research. So I'm not sharing this information just as a way to try to get people involved in research studies. So that's one way that you can share your stories. But other ways are equally important. Thinking about talking with your care provider. So how to positively impact your own care. Sharing your experience with care providers, making sure that you feel like you're being listened to and that you have time to get those thoughts out. When you meet with your physician, they may not be able to be with you for an hour. So again, it's a great idea to write down those things that you need to talk to them before you go into that appointment. For example, here's an experience that I had, doctor, and I need to talk to you about it because I'm not sure how to deal with it. Or is there another treatment that I could try because I'm having this new challenge that I haven't had before? And support groups are another great way. That is an excellent outlet to listen to people's stories, to learn from them, and also to share your story to help others and to, again, get things off your chest too. The importance of sharing your story with advocacy and policy groups. So groups like the Brain Injury Association of Ohio or the American Brain Injury Association or Brain Injury Association of America. Those groups are out there to help advocate for individuals who've had traumatic brain injuries. And so they need people to share their stories and in order to help drive the work that they do. And of course, social media is a great way that people can connect with other individuals who are having similar experiences. One thing I've learned in my research is that a lot of parents turn to social media groups to connect with other families who are in similar situations. And there are positives and negatives about that. But certainly it is a way that you can share your story and also be in touch with other individuals who may have similar experiences. So I want to wrap up before we have questions and discussion with this last quote, that we are all connected by a simple wish to be visible, to be heard, and to know that we matter. And I think this is really important as we think about sharing our stories and listening to the stories of other people, because sharing our story helps us to be understood, and listening to other people's stories helps us understand them and understand their experiences as well. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we can have some questions and discussions, and I am open to your emails as well after today's talk.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lundine. And this was really good because it kind of gave the whole gamut of, what we could think about and how we could approach it. And it doesn't have to be all of those things, right? You don't have to be
Right.
all of those questions. Those are just potential avenues, and even one of those would be worthwhile.
Absolutely.
So, does anybody have questions for Dr. Lundine? What questions do you have? Go ahead, Michelle. Let's see. Can I make sure that you can all unmute? Yeah. Here.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. You go by Jenny or Jennifer?
Yeah, Jenny. Jenny's fine.
Jenny, okay, thanks.
Unless I'm in trouble.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so anyway, I have traumatic brain injury, okay, about 11 years ago. Now, I was hoping, I see you're focusing on children, but you're also willing to learn, it sounds like, from older folks. Is that correct?
Sure.
Even though your research isn't focused on them right now?
Correct,
right?
Yeah.
But it could be used. Okay, that's great. So, I'd like to offer help if you need to talk to an older person that has TBI. Okay, so I offer my help, and are many positives. I liked your statement. I found many positives out of TBI. So actually your personality before the traumatic brain injury gets ramped way up. That's good for parents to know about their children.
Can I stop for 1 second? Kata, are you hearing the feedback?
I'm not hearing it on my end.
You're not hearing any feedback?
No.
Okay, Michelle, sorry. For some reason, I'm gonna disconnect my earbuds and see if I can hear you better. Right now, I hear you okay, so maybe I'll let you. I'm not sure where I was getting breakdown there. So I missed part of what you said. I heard you say you were offering your help as an adult who sustained a traumatic brain injury, and then maybe start from there. I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Myself.
Kadar?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, that's where I had basically started. And then I'm thinking that information from adults, as far back as I can, could help children too. So, and what I liked, this is what I was starting to say, I think, when you couldn't hear me, was that there are many positives that you can find out of traumatic brain injury. So the main one is your personality before the TBI gets ramped way up. And that's good, positive stuff for the parents to hear. So, because most kids are going to have, a really good personality. So that's a blessing, actually. Then they also need to know that anger is a part. You probably already know that.
Absolutely.
So I hope that's expressed to the parents that their child. Okay, great. That's good.
Yeah, no, but again, those are great points. And as I mentioned, when you have a traumatic brain injury as a child, you grow into an adult who has a traumatic brain injury. Right. And so, we're still trying to understand, how that might be different than an adult who sustains a TBI. But a lot of that is the same, those personality issues or difficulties or challenges and anger issues and, sadness too, right? These are all normal parts of getting through and living with an injury.
Yeah, and I would hope and pray that maybe young children, because they are forming, And the brain is this amazing organ that maybe they could get through it better than adults can. So we can only hope, and I'm glad you're doing the research for that.
Well, thank you.
Great.
Thanks, and thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Sure. And just one little funny thing. I like to do funny stuff because I was born April Fool's Day. So that's a blessing in my life.
I like it. Absolutely.
Funny thing was right at the beginning, one of your first slides, you're talking about how people get confused and they can't hear what the person's saying. They might say that. Well, here's what's funny. Okay. A lot of people with traumatic brain injury, myself included, have problems with their hearing from the accident. So I had trouble hearing out of my left ear.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, even though there was no visible injury there. I mean, it was right here on this side, but see, that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle.
Sure.
Does anybody else have a question?
Yeah, the hearing I'm familiar with older people. My mother is one, but I'm around a lot of people that have hearing problems. Down at campus, there's a pricey hall.
Oh, so
yeah,
Perry, that's true. So Perry has been part of Jen Brello's group.
Yeah.
And Jenny's lab is just down the hall.
Yeah, Perry, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. Absolutely.
My mother's she just turned 80, so I'm not going to say a lot about it.
Yeah.
Well, Jenny, I've got a couple questions here.
Sure.
So we talked about, actually you answered a lot of the questions that I was coming up with. So I'm digging a little deeper today.
All right.
So I think there's some easy ones. So you talked about the stories have negative and positives. And I love what Michelle said, about, the positives that can come out of brain injury. And I think it's important to talk about those. So what do you think? Can stories with negative information be helpful? And sort of here's the twist. Do you think positive stories are better? Or could they be not as good?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's value in both, right? So we need to understand why some people have positive stories and why some people struggle, right? Because that helps us figure out what is it about the people who are telling more positive stories. How could we use that information to help us, boost the people who are having more struggles? So of course, negative stories are going to help us identify the problems, but I'm sure all of us, like we all know there's lots of problems. There's lots of things we could fix. And I don't have enough time in my life to address all those things, but the way we can start to try to figure those out and kind of narrow in is using the positive stories. So we use the positive stories to say, well, this family had a good experience at school. Let's figure out what is it about them. Now we can't fix everything for every family. So maybe it's because this family, has a lot of money and can pay for lots of extra therapy services. Well, that's not going to work for every family. But maybe we could say we need to make therapy more available using teletherapy so that families who live, far away from Columbus could also benefit from working with people who have experience with brain injury, where that maybe, in their small town in rural Ohio, they don't have people like that. And so we can use those positive stories to help us address and figure out, where to start, I think. Because sometimes when we listen to all the negative stories, it's really easy to feel discouraged about what we're doing, and that the problem is so big we can't fix it. And knowing that there are positive stories helps us kind of focus in, I think.
And so they both have their kind of role.
Absolutely.
And in balance, it's kind of where you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
You had a follow-up? Michelle, did you have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to, let you both know. I mean, I really love that idea. And of course, you could use people like me, people that you've vetted, that you feel comfortable with, that could be a mentor to the parents of the children, because they could do it like separately. They could still be there when they're talking to their child if they feel comfortable, but using a mentor would help. You can show somebody that.
Absolutely.
So that would help the parents.
That's
I
a great
really
point,
like that
Michelle.
idea. Yeah, I like that a ton because, Jenny, when we've talked about things in the past, and even in this whole process, the way that I've been thinking about it is, you find somebody that's your peer or that has had the same experience, right? Caregiver to caregiver, survivor to survivor. But Michelle, I like the concept of having the survivor be able to shape what a caregiver might see in someone that's a completely different age. I mean, that's a really wonderful way to think about it.
Absolutely.
I could be the grandma.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I would love that because I'm proud, that I'm 65 and I make them laugh, telling them I'm an old geezer.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing.
Oh, that's
Old
okay.
school
Mine
phone.
did too. Yeah.
So I have another question, but please, if you have one out there, feel free to jump in. So Jenny, you talked a lot about advocacy and policy, which I love because, that's honestly, if there's a soapbox moment here, it's that we really need better advocacy in Ohio. Our state does not spend very much money on brain injury services or resources. And as you said a couple times, if you get away from the cities, it's pretty stark. And so, these stories really, really do matter. And we're coming up with ways both at Ohio State and also across the state to try and figure out how can we collect those stories and try to bring them together. But research, like what Jenny does, certainly supports a lot of that. So here's two questions, and I think there's a lot of humor in them, but I think there also hopefully some good value here. So you used memes at the beginning to try and communicate a little bit more about where you're coming from or how this might make sense, right? If I see a dog, of course I'm going to be happy about it, but also it was a good way to express you might not understand, but it's important to empathize and also sympathize. So. That's a really interesting kind of tool. Have you come across people who have found more success using a different way of speaking to be able to help communicate their story?
That's a great question. I mean, now I think, especially as probably younger people, more than say our older crew, are using, GIFs and memes and emojis and all those kinds of things to communicate. I have two middle schoolers, and now that they have phones, I mean, my 11-year-old daughter sends she communicates so amazingly through, GIFs and memes, that it cracks me up that, she is able to think about, I'm going to search for, frustrating, and I'm going to pick this hilarious picture to send to my mom who just told me to come unload the dishwasher or whatever. So I don't have any research on it. I think it's an amazing idea, and I think it would be, I mean, again, I didn't include that on the slide, this slide about, how to tell your story. But sure, tell your story in GIFs and memes and emojis. Because there's lots of people who can understand that. And the people who can't understand it, then you have to practice, explaining what you mean through those different mediums. So I think that's a really interesting question. It's a great research question for sure. I don't have any good data for you, but I like it.
You'll have to come back to us for a pilot award on that.
All right, I will. Can I use my own kids?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have a second question?
Yeah, so there's a sort of a follow-up, right? So we see a lot of this stuff on social media and in text form as well. And of course, I like the idea of your daughter sending you those in response to chores. That's fantastic. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about social media, and I think that's kind of the parallel to what we're doing here, right? Having an in-person-ish meeting where we're talking to one another. But in pandemic, social media becomes another great outlet. Um, Now there's good and bad with social media, and of course you want to be responsible. So just some general ideas on what to do or what's helpful or what could be harmful or not safe.
Hmm.
Share your story about your injury on social media.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. That is a really important issue that I didn't really think about talking about until you mentioned that. So I'm glad you thought about that. Definitely, I think, especially for people with brain injury. I don't know if any of you who've had a brain injury experienced this. Certainly, we see this with teenagers when they're in the hospital, that they don't always understand the impact of their actions or their words, right? And so where we have a filter where we can most of the time, right, stop ourselves from saying something, using text and social media, it's a lot easier to disconnect yourself from that filter because I'm not in front of you, right? So if I insulted Kadar right now, I would feel bad because he can see me, you can hear me. That would make, I would feel guilty about that later. I would never insult you. But it would be easier if Kadar and I were, on Twitter or on Facebook and he posted something that I disagreed with, that I said something rude because, I'm not in front of him and the consequences are less, or I feel less consequence because we're not connecting in this, normal, old way, traditional way. So I think we do have to think about that. And I think that's important for people who don't have brain injuries, right? I mean, we all are aware of, fights that happen on social media because people say things that maybe they wouldn't say to someone's face. And that is a problem that is even a greater concern for individuals with brain injury who may struggle even more with a loss of filter. And so, you can have consequences where people, lose friends or peers, stop talking to them because they may say things that are, too open, even, sharing too much of your story. And not having someone there to say, maybe it's not the right time or the right place for that part of your story. Let's get to know this person a little bit more before we talk about, marriage problems. Or, maybe you didn't want that to come out in public. And so I think we need to be careful. It's always good to have someone, checking over and making sure that you're not putting yourself out there too much. You're not saying something that you might regret later. And not that you want to change your story to make people feel more comfortable, but just making sure that the way you share your story is the way you want it to be understood, I guess.
No, I like that. I think that makes sense. You're doing it for a reason, and you want to make sure that it's matching up with what happens.
Yeah, I realize I just talked a lot to answer that question. I'm
No,
sorry.
that's good.
That was a
That's
lot.
and one thing that I would suggest in there, because you said, it's easier to sort of hide behind your keyboard and make a comment or say something that you might not otherwise say. But I think that anonymity can be helpful when you share your story, right? Because
Yeah.
also guard yourself from some of the consequences of just being very honest, and maybe you need to be bluntly honest
Sure.
the way that you share your story. And I'll give you an example. So we don't really think about this as social media, but there's a website called Reddit. And it's a message board. I see some and some people recognize this. There's a TBI community on Reddit, and it's one place where, yeah, there you go. All right, so we know some people that are there. So it's a really helpful place in my mind, because there is a very honest sharing of people's experiences, and people disagree, and people can really get into a subject pretty. They can offer help. And so it's not to say that I'm saying you should go to Reddit right away and go do this, right? There's
Yeah.
that, and you want to really make sure that you do it in a way that's comfortable. But that kind of little wall between you, the person, and you telling the story can be helpful. I mean, Jenny, what do you think about people sharing in that environment, and also maybe the implications for your work.
For my work, like my research, or
Yeah.
yeah. So I think what I first want to say is, when we take in other people's stories, we need to be careful too, because it's important to listen to other people's experiences. And I even said, you might get an idea for a treatment that you haven't thought about for yourself. But we also have to be careful, because we want to make sure we're, making safe decisions. And so just because someone tells you, they took this medication and it helps them do X, that doesn't mean that that medication is going to be right for you. Or, I won't use more specific examples, but I think, again, we need to be careful. And we need to check with people who have, better understanding of these things. So, going to your physician and saying, hey, this person recommended, this medication, and it would make, X better for me. What do you think about that? And I think that's important, because we want to make sure, people could say whatever they want. They can share whatever they want. And again, sometimes that can be helpful, but we need to make sure we're being smart about how we use that for ourselves too. So that's, I think, the first thing I want to say. And then your question was, how does that relate to my work?
Yeah, yeah. Just are there opportunities to look at stories that are shared sort of in this public forum,
Mm-hmm.
and use those to help understand experience, or maybe move policy, and those kinds of things?
Absolutely. I actually know a researcher in Australia who is doing that exact work, whose work is looking at social media and looking at the themes that come from people's stories and what people share on social media. So, yeah, someone is doing that. And I mean, it's great, because, again, there are lots and lots of venues to look for that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions? Go ahead, Anne.
Hi. Thanks for hosting this. First of all, we didn't get a chance to go to last week, so we'll catch up on that another time. But this is my husband, Greg. Greg is the TBI survivor of the two of us. He's actually, it's still really fresh for us. His injury happened a year ago tomorrow, so we're still
wow.
very fresh in the recovery and trying to figure out what new normal looks like.
Absolutely.
So, and this is something that's been kind of going through my mind, at least, is trying to figure out what sort of involvement we could start to do, because, we started the new year, we started the new therapy, like the insurances got reapproved, and now we're set, and it sort of feels like we're kind of content right now, but there is kind of an opportunity time-wise for us to get more involved in things. But obviously we don't want to overextend ourselves, because we're still very much trying to kind of get a grasp on what we're dealing with. Excuse me. So what sort of advocacy groups could someone seek out, probably more related to, obviously, a young adult or adult injury, but what sort of venues can we explore to sort of kind of help start sharing his story and give back and contribute to the community?
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for sharing your story with us. Appreciate it. And I think there are a couple of things that I can think of, and Kedar might have some other ideas as well. Perry mentioned coming to the OSU. There is a group there that meets now. I'm sorry, my dog is joining me on the couch. Yeah, I know, right? She's gonna come lay by me. So there's a cute puppy. Okay, so diversion. I lost my train of thought. At OSU, there is a group that meets. They used to meet in person. They're meeting virtually right now, but obviously the hope is that they will be back in person, right, Perry?
Yes, I would think
Right.
so.
Eventually. And it is a group that's focused on adults who have had brain injuries, lots of individuals who have trouble with communication, but also people who don't and have had brain injuries that don't affect their communication. But they work on participation-focused activities. So things that are interesting to the group members help other group members. There are undergrad and graduate students who are learning and also working with the individuals.
They have different ways to work together, and people are different. Everybody's different on what they can do, and
absolutely. Thank you, Perry. That's exactly right. So everyone, comes with different strengths and different needs, and the group kind of helps each other and picks, fun things to do that are interesting. Whether they've done things like picked a show, and everyone's homework is to watch the show, and then they come back to the group and they talk about the next episode of the show together, something like that. So I mean, all kinds of things. And another great thing about it is it's free, because one of the big challenges, which you may or may not know yet, is that there can be challenges in the long term, and your insurance coverage stops paying because there's this terrible belief that you stop getting better after a certain amount of time, which is silly and untrue. And yet, unfortunately, they stop paying for you to go to places that help you get better. So that's one thing about this group that's really great. So if you reach out to me, or if you reach out to Kadar, we could connect you if that's something that's interesting. And even if it's not interesting now and you want to look at it later, when you don't have insurance, that's fine too. Obviously you don't have to do any of this, but just some ideas. There are support groups. I don't know if DOD has a support group anymore. I know Ohio Health has a support group that meets, I believe, monthly. And I hear great things about it. I don't know. I see Michelle nodding her head. I don't know if you ever participate in that.
Oh, yes. I was there for several years.
Awesome.
The problem is it meets at the same time as you guys do.
Well, we're glad you chose us, I guess.
Yeah.
So the Dempsey Center over at Ohio Health has a TBI support group. They go monthly. It is also on Thursday nights around the same time. So
it starts at 6.
Yeah, okay. So we're actually trying to think about how we're going to shift our schedule so that we can make sure that people don't have to make the choice.
That's nice.
And there is a support group over at DOD, or actually, I guess it would be Martha Morehouse because it's outpatient based.
Right. Yeah.
It's a social worker that runs that. There's actually 2, and now kind of 3, because one is split into 2 different ones. And so and you said this is newer in your lives. We have a young survivor group, and it sounds like that would be like 18 to 25. It's not. It's like 18 to 45, probably.
I think that's the one. That's how we heard about this.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Yeah.
So Joy, who runs that group, that's a good one. And then there's a parents version of that, as a lot of people are coming with their parents to that group as well. There's also the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. So that's a group that I am a trustee for. We do a lot of helping people find resources, but now I think the group is starting to shift towards advocacy. And so a couple things that would be interesting, I think maybe one at our March NeuroNights session, we are collecting stories and would like people to share their stories at our second session of the month. And I don't know the date offhand. I can look that up, and we can reach out. But if you are interested in that, definitely get in touch with us. You can email Julie, who sends out all the reminders for this, and we can put you in the queue for that. Anybody who's interested to share their story, we would encourage you to do that. We'll feature as many as we can, but I think it's helpful for us to get those in. And the second is also in March. We have the Ohio TBI Summit. And that is an educational conference for health practitioners, but it's also for survivors and family members as well. And there's a lot of really interesting things to learn and people to connect to and resources to look into. This year, it's focused on empowerment, advocacy, and using education and research to help with those things. So sort of as Jenny said, we're doing this research, and then where does it go? Well, it hopefully can impact the way that we practice, and it can, and maybe impact the way that we fund and support from a state or even federal level. So that's another place where we have storytelling. And every year we have a TBI survivor come and speak. This year we have a guy named Kevin Pierce, who is an Olympic hopeful in snowboarding. Had his injury. He's a well-known speaker and has a foundation now. And so he'll be giving a story, and we'll also be talking about just the value of storytelling and in Ohio advocacy. There's also another guy who actually I was hoping would be here tonight, but he did participate in a very long meeting with me before this, so maybe he was a little tired of it. His name's Spencer Smith. He is also on the board for Brain Injury Association of Ohio, and he tells his story a lot as well. He had an injury a few years ago. Now he's a PhD student at Ohio State, and his family started up essentially a nonprofit to tell their story and also help educate doctors who did not quite understand what he was going through as a brain injury survivor, because he was in a car crash and he had a lot of other things going on, and they did not recognize that he had the brain injury. And as he said just today, he often felt like he was the expert on brain injury in any room where he was with his docs.
Wow.
So is it a very impactful story? Because for me, that's actually how I got into all the things that we're doing, because I heard that story. And so Spencer would be another person to try and connect with to see how he got into it and how that experience has been for him. So I know that's a lot, and certainly reach out and we can sort of tease all that apart and figure out what might be interesting and useful for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go from there.
Thank you.
Right.
Anyone else have a question or comment or idea or interested to share their story? Okay, well, we are a couple minutes over, so I'll thank you for all staying, and importantly, thank you to Dr. Lundine for presenting to us tonight. This is really great, and look forward to seeing all of you next week when we come back to discuss how you would like to use this information and where we can create those opportunities to share your story even more.
Thank you all. Really appreciate being here, and hope to meet you in person sometime soon. Be
Very
safe.
good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, have a good
Thank
and safe
you.
night.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Bye.